The stars glittered above as Kara piloted her sleek Zorian craft through the cold void of space. Her violet-skinned hands danced over the holographic controls with precision, navigating toward Earth, a place she had never desired to see. To Kara, Earth was a primitive world, a backward planet with a species incapable of harnessing the true potential of the universe. She loathed the thought of having to interact with its people. But orders were orders. The Zorian Council had sent her on this reconnaissance mission to evaluate the humans, to determine whether they were a threat or a potential ally in the galactic network. Zoria had always been cautious, measuring every species carefully before making contact. Yet Kara couldn't understand why Earth was even worth the trouble. As her craft approached the blue and green planet, something went wrong. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in her ship's systems, barely noticeable to a less experienced pilot. Kara frowned, her glowing eyes scanning the control panel for anomalies. The ship's core systems, advanced beyond anything Earth could ever hope to understand, were suddenly fluctuating. That's impossible, she thought. Zorian technology didn't malfunction. Before she could react, the craft lurched violently. Kara's breath caught as the sleek ship was pulled into a descent, plummeting toward the planet's surface. The Earth's magnetic field, so much cruder and unpredictable than she had anticipated, disrupted her stabilizers. She fought the controls, but gravity was a force even Zorian technology couldn't fully dismiss. Alarms blared, lights flashed, and the ship careened downward, breaking through the atmosphere in a fiery tail of plasma. No, no, no! Kara's hands moved in a blur, trying every possible override, every manual reset, but nothing worked. The ship spiraled uncontrollably, and Kara was forced to activate the emergency crash protocols. Her vessel slammed into the Earth's surface with a deafening impact, sending dirt and debris flying in every direction. The once sleek craft now lay in a smoking, twisted wreck. Kara felt the shock of the crash jolt through her body, even with the ship's energy shields cushioning much of the blow. Her head swam, her vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went dark. When she came to, she was surrounded by the foreign sounds of earth-chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the distant hum of human machinery. Kara gritted her teeth as she unstrapped herself from the pilot's seat, her body aching from the crash. Her ship, once a masterpiece of Zorian engineering, was now a mangled heap of metal and broken systems. Smoke rose from the crumpled hull, and the faint crackling of electricity filled the air. Her heart sank as she surveyed the damage. The ship's core power was completely offline. The communication systems were shattered, leaving her stranded and unable to send a distress signal to Zoria. Worst of all, the environmental controls were compromised. The ship had shielded her from the Earth's atmosphere, but now, with the life support systems down, she could feel the weight of the planet's pollution and oxygen levels pressing against her lungs. Kara stumbled out of the wreckage, her long silver hair cascading down her back, and her glowing blue eyes scanned the dark landscape. She was in the middle of a forest, the trees swaying ominously under the faint moonlight. It was unsettling, so unlike the pristine world she was used to. The air smelled strange, heavy with the scent of fuel and damp earth. It made her nauseous. She wiped a streak of dirt from her lavender-colored skin, her body still shaking with the aftershock of the crash. As much as she despised admitting it, she was in serious trouble. Her advanced knowledge of Zorian technology wouldn't help her here. Nothing on Earth could possibly have the resources or expertise she needed to repair her ship. Kara activated her wrist device, a small flicker of holographic light appearing as she tried to assess the damage to her craft. The readouts were grim. She didn't have long before the atmosphere started to wear her down. Without the life support systems, Earth's pollution would slowly poison her, weakening her body until it was too late. Of all the backwater planets, she muttered bitterly, her voice hoarse. She felt a sharp pang of helplessness, a feeling she wasn't accustomed to. Zorians were trained to be self-reliant, to solve their own problems. Depending on others, especially humans, was beneath her. But as her mind raced, she knew the brutal truth. I have no choice. She scanned her surroundings, her advanced vision picking up on distant lights. There, just a few kilometers away, she spotted a small human settlement. A cluster of dimly lit buildings, likely a mechanic shop judging by the crude tools and mechanical debris scattered outside. Kara's lip curled in disgust. A mechanic, of all things. Her pride screamed at her to find another way. But the reality was undeniable. Her ship's damage was far beyond her ability to repair without help. She needed parts, and she needed someone who understood the basics of machinery, even if they were an unsophisticated human. With her heart pounding and her body still aching, Kara staggered toward the human settlement. Each step felt like an insult to her pride, but survival was more important now. She would do what she had to, get the help she needed, and leave this wretched planet behind as soon as her ship was operational again. As she approached the mechanic shop, Kara's mind raced with a mix of emotions: hatred for the humans, disgust for their crude planet, and a growing sense of desperation. She would never forgive herself for what she was about to do. But as the dim light of the mechanic shop flickered ahead of her, Kara knew she was out of options. She reached the edge of the shop, her body trembling from the Earth's unfamiliar gravity and the strain of her crash landing. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face the human who would unknowingly hold her life in their hands. The faint glow of the shop lights spilled across the cracked pavement as Ben Holton wiped grease from his hands. Another long day. The shop was quiet now, save for the low hum of the radio playing an old blues tune. Tools were scattered around the room: wrenches, screwdrivers, ratchets, and scattered parts from half-finished projects. Ben ran a hand through his messy, oil-streaked hair and leaned back against the counter, enjoying the brief silence. For Ben, life had become a simple routine of fixing what was broken. It was a far cry from what he had once dreamed of as a kid. Space. He'd always wanted to work with the stars, build things that could travel to distant planets, maybe even see them himself. But dreams have a way of crumbling under the weight of reality. His career in aerospace engineering had been short-lived after his designs were overshadowed by corporate greed and bureaucratic red tape. He had drifted back to the small town where he grew up and took over the old mechanic shop after his dad passed away. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, which was enough for him until tonight. The night was still and humid, the kind of air that made everything feel heavy. Ben was about to close up when the ground beneath him shook violently, rattling the tools on the walls. He heard a deep, thunderous crash somewhere in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal tearing through trees. His heart raced. What the hell was that? Ben muttered to himself, grabbing a flashlight and stepping outside. His shop was at the edge of town, and beyond it lay nothing but forest for miles. The crash had come from somewhere deep in those woods. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Whatever it wasn't a normal sound, not a car wreck, not a falling tree. This was different. Curiosity gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, Ben grabbed his old toolbox and ventured into the trees, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air smelled strange, like something burned, mixed with a metallic tang. As he pushed deeper into the woods, the smell grew stronger. Then he saw it. A glowing wreck lay in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by shattered trees and smoking debris. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a plane or a satellite. It wasn't anything he had ever seen before. The craft was sleek, streamlined, and utterly alien. Its metallic surface gleamed under the moonlight, twisted and scorched from the impact. Ben's eyes widened in awe, taking in the jagged edges and strange symbols that adorned the ship's hull. He had spent his life around machines, but nothing had prepared him for this. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. He was staring at something extraterrestrial, something that proved all the childhood stories of space travel and alien civilizations were real. And then he saw her. A figure stumbled from the wreckage, barely able to stand. She was tall, slender, and unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her skin shimmered in the low light, a soft violet hue, and her eyes glowing blue and piercing met his. Ben froze, unsure of whether to run or help. She looked like she was in pain, struggling to walk as she clutched her side. Before he could react, the alien collapsed at his feet, her body crumpling against the dirt and debris. Ben dropped to his knees beside her, the mechanic in him taking over his initial shock. She was alive, but just barely. "Hey! Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly as he checked her pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Her skin felt cool to the touch, unlike any human's. The alien stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She fixed him with a glare that was both furious and desperate. "Get away from me, human," she hissed, her voice weak but filled with venom. Her accent was strange, the words laced with an otherworldly tone, but he understood her perfectly. Ben blinked, taken aback. "Look, I don't know what you are or where you're from, but you're hurt. I can help you," he said, his voice calm despite his racing heart. He had no idea what he was doing. What the hell did one do when they found a crashed alien in the woods? "I don't need your primitive help," she spat, though the effort to speak seemed to drain her. Her head lolled back, and her body went limp again. Ben hesitated for a moment, then scooped her up into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her slender frame almost weightless. He carried her toward the shop, careful not to jostle her too much. His mind was spinning. Who was she? Why was she here? And what had happened to her ship? When he reached the shop, Ben laid the alien girl on the workbench, moving aside spare parts and tools to make space for her. He didn't have a medical kit, certainly not one designed for extraterrestrial life, but he knew basic first aid. He quickly grabbed a clean cloth and wiped away the grime and blood-like substance oozing from her side. She had a nasty gash across her abdomen, but it wasn't quite like any injury he'd seen before. Her skin was more resilient, almost like a flexible armor, but it had been damaged in the crash. She stirred again, her eyes narrowing as she realized where she was. "I told you." "I don't need your help," she muttered, but her voice was weaker now. "Yeah, well, you don't look like you're in a position to argue," Ben said, his hand steady as he worked to clean the wound. "You can hate me later. Right now, you need to not bleed out on my workbench." Kara glared at him, her pride flaring even in her weakened state. She hated the idea of being at the mercy of a human, of all things. Zorians were superior in every way, she reminded herself, but her body wasn't listening. The atmosphere, the crash, the unfamiliar gravity, it was all too much. She needed him, whether she liked it or not. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she rasped, struggling to stay conscious. "What do you want?" Ben met her eyes, his face serious. "I don't want anything. I'm just trying to help you." Kara couldn't comprehend it. Zorians helped each other for duty, for honor, but never without expecting something in return. Humans, she thought bitterly, were supposed to be selfish, crude creatures. But this mechanic didn't seem to fit that mold. Ben finished dressing the wound as best he could. He knew it was only a temporary fix, but it would have to do for now. He stepped back, letting out a slow breath. "There. That should hold until you're feeling better." Kara's glowing eyes flickered as she studied him. Despite her every instinct telling her to push him away, she was too weak to resist. And, deep down, she knew she needed time to figure out how to repair her ship, how to survive on this primitive planet. As she lay there, her pride wounded along with her body, she hated every second of it. Hated that she was in this position, hated that she had to rely on a human. But for now, she had no choice. Ben cleaned his hands, looking at the wreckage visible through the open shop doors. "What the hell were you flying?" he asked, more to himself than her. Kara's lips twitched in a grim smile, though it was laced with exhaustion. "Something you couldn't possibly understand, human." He raised an eyebrow. "Try me. I'm good with machines." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air heavy with the weight of their differences. Kara closed her eyes, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion. Ben watched her for a moment longer, then turned his attention back to the smoking wreck in the distance. Whatever she was, wherever she had come from, this was just the beginning. The morning light filtered through the windows of the mechanic's shop, casting a warm glow over the cluttered workbench. Ben sat on a worn-out stool, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, his eyes fixed on the mysterious alien still lying unconscious on the makeshift bed he had set up in the corner. The events of the previous night felt surreal, as though they had been pulled from one of the sci-fi movies he occasionally watched. But the proof of what had happened was right in front of him: an alien, flesh and blood, and a crashed spacecraft out in the woods. Kara stirred, her glowing blue eyes flickering open. Her expression quickly shifted from groggy disorientation to sharp, focused awareness. The moment she realized where she was, her body tensed, and her piercing gaze landed on Ben. Her pride hadn't faded overnight. If anything, it had returned with full force. "Still alive," Ben muttered, setting his coffee down. He stood and approached her, unsure how to break the tension. "How do you feel?" "I feel like a prisoner," Kara snapped, her voice still hoarse but regaining its bite. She tried to sit up, but the strain on her abdomen forced her to wince. "Did you drug me, human?" Ben raised his hands defensively. No. You passed out from your injuries, that's all. I just patched you up. And technically, you're free to leave whenever you want." Kara narrowed her eyes, suspicious but too exhausted to argue further. She shifted her weight, testing her body's limits. The wound was healing slowly, her Zorian physiology mending the damage at a pace far faster than any human's, but she was still far from fully recovered. "Where's my ship?" she asked coldly, refusing to soften her stance. Ben gestured toward the woods. "Still out there, a bit worse for wear. I took a look at it this morning, but I couldn't make heads or tails of the tech you've got in there. It's like nothing I've ever seen." Kara scoffed, her lip curling. "Of course it's beyond your comprehension. It's Zorian technology, far more advanced than anything this planet has ever created." Ben shrugged. "Yeah, I figured. But broken tech is broken tech. And I'm pretty good at fixing things, even if I don't fully understand how they work." Kara's mind raced. She needed to get her ship functional again fast. Her mission was to observe Earth, not interact with its people, and certainly not rely on them. Every second she spent on this planet was a failure in her eyes. But without the right parts, without her tools, she was stuck. Ben was right about one thing: human technology was primitive. There was no way she could repair her ship with the junk this planet had to offer. "You're wasting your time," Kara said, her voice low. "Even if I let you near my ship, your tools, your machines, they're worthless compared to what I need." Ben scratched the back of his head, thinking for a moment. "Yeah, you're probably right. But that doesn't mean we can't get creative. If you can tell me how your systems work, maybe I can improvise." Kara blinked, taken aback by his persistence. "Improvise? With Earth junk?" He nodded. "You'd be surprised what a good mechanic can do with junk." For a moment, Kara said nothing. The prideful part of her wanted to scoff, to reject his offer outright. But deep down, she knew the truth: she was stranded, vulnerable, and without other options. If there was even a chance this human could help, she had to take it. "You're overestimating yourself, human," Kara said sharply. "But fine. I'll let you try. Don't expect much." Ben grinned, the spark of a challenge igniting in his eyes. "I won't let you down." They spent the next few hours outside, Ben walking around the wreckage of Kara's ship, while Kara begrudgingly explained the basics of its systems. Her explanations were clipped, filled with condescending remarks about the inferiority of Earth's engineering, but Ben took it all in stride. He asked questions, lots of them, about the power core, the propulsion systems, and the materials used in Zorian construction. Kara answered reluctantly, impressed despite herself by how quickly Ben seemed to grasp concepts she expected him to fumble through. She noticed that while his tools were rudimentary by Zorian standards, he had an almost intuitive sense of mechanics. He didn't just follow the rules, he thought beyond them, coming up with inventive ways to work around the limitations of his environment. It was unexpected. As the hours passed, they made slow but steady progress. Ben managed to rig a temporary power source using parts from a nearby generator and some car batteries. It wasn't perfect, and Kara doubted it would hold for long, but it was enough to power up a few essential systems. Her ship hummed faintly, and a small smile of relief tugged at her lips, though she quickly masked it with her usual cold demeanor. "You're not as incompetent as I thought," Kara muttered, trying not to let her approval show. Ben smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'll take that as a compliment." But just as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the quiet. Kara's eyes snapped toward the road, her body tensing. Ben frowned and turned toward the shop, where the sound of revving engines grew louder. "What now?" he muttered. Within moments, a group of rough-looking men on dirt bikes and trucks appeared at the edge of the woods, their headlights cutting through the trees. They were local scavengers, the kind who prowled the area looking for anything of value. Ben had dealt with them before he knew their type. They took what they wanted, by force if necessary. "Great," Ben said under his breath. "Just what we need." Kara's heart raced. She didn't know what these humans were after, but she could see the greed in their eyes as they spotted the wreckage. They wanted her ship, or at least the technology it contained. She could fight, but she was still weakened from the crash and her wounds. She didn't have her full strength, and if they overpowered her... No. She couldn't afford to think like that. Ben stepped forward, placing himself between Kara and the scavengers. "Look, guys, there's nothing here for you," he said calmly. "Just a wreck and some scrap. Not worth the trouble." The leader of the group, a burly man with a sneer on his face, eyed the ship behind Ben. "Looks like more than scrap to me. Ain't never seen anything like it." Ben clenched his jaw. "Yeah, well, it's nothing you can use." The man's sneer widened. "We'll be the judge of that." Before Ben could respond, the scavengers advanced, one of them drawing a knife as they moved toward the ship. Kara's eyes narrowed. She could feel her pulse quicken, adrenaline flooding her system. Her instincts screamed at her to fight, but Ben placed a hand on her arm, a silent signal to wait. "I'm telling you," Ben said, his voice harder now, "you don't want to mess with this." The scavenger with the knife sneered and swung at Ben, but before the blade could make contact, Kara's body moved on instinct. In a flash, she grabbed the scavenger's arm, twisting it with lightning speed, forcing him to drop the knife with a yelp of pain. Her movements were swift and precise, her Zorian combat training kicking in despite her weakened state. The scavengers looked at her, wide-eyed, realizing she was no ordinary human. But instead of backing down, they grew more aggressive, several of them pulling weapons and advancing toward both Kara and Ben. In the chaos, Ben grabbed a nearby wrench, using it to fend off one of the attackers, while Kara fought with precision, disarming and disabling two more in quick succession. But she was tiring, and fast. Her body hadn't fully recovered, and she couldn't keep this up much longer. Just when it seemed like the fight would turn against them, a blast of energy erupted from Kara's wrist device. She hadn't meant to use it, her systems were still damaged, but in her desperation, the defense mechanism activated, sending a shockwave that knocked the scavengers to the ground. Ben, wide-eyed, stared at the unconscious men around them. What was that?" Kara, panting, stood over the fallen scavengers, her body trembling from the exertion. "A last resort," she muttered, before collapsing to her knees. Ben rushed to her side, catching her before she fell completely. "Easy, easy," he said, his voice gentle. "I've got you." Kara's head spun, her vision blurring. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean on him. She hated how vulnerable she felt, but in that moment, she had no choice. "Why did you fight for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ben looked at her, his expression serious but kind. "Because you needed help. Isn't that enough?" Kara's heart raced, a feeling she couldn't name stirring inside her. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she hated this human as much as she thought she did. Kara lay in the corner of Ben's workshop, her breathing shallow as her body worked to recover from the intense fight with the scavengers. Her wrist device had drained most of her remaining energy, leaving her weaker than before. The humans she had faced were far more violent than she had anticipated. Primitive, yes, but dangerous all the same. Ben had spent the last hour making sure she was stable, cleaning her wounds again and offering her water, though she had barely acknowledged him. He could tell she was still wrestling with her pride. Even though they had just fought side by side, Kara seemed reluctant to admit she needed any help at all. Ben was exhausted, too. The adrenaline was wearing off, and as he sat beside her, he found himself thinking over everything that had happened. An alien, an actual, real alien, had crashed into his life, and now he was trying to help her get off Earth. It all felt like a dream, but the blood on his hands and the bruises on his arms told him otherwise. The shop was quiet now, the scavengers long gone, either scared off or knocked unconscious by Kara's energy blast. Ben knew they might come back, but right now, that wasn't his biggest concern. His biggest concern was the alien girl who had risked her life to protect him. Kara stirred, her glowing blue eyes opening slowly. Ben could see the pain etched across her face as she sat up, her movements stiff. She glanced at him briefly, her expression guarded. "You're still here," she muttered, her voice low but more steady than it had been before. Ben nodded, leaning against the wall. "Yeah. Not going anywhere until I know you're okay." She scoffed softly, though there was no real malice in it. "Humans. Always so sentimental." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Kara didn't respond right away. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. Her mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. Back on Zoria, she had always been taught that humans were beneath her people, that they were small-minded and driven by self-interest. But this human, this mechanic, had risked everything for her, fought to protect her, even when she had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. "Why?" Kara whispered, opening her eyes but keeping her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Why did you protect me back there? You could have run. You could have let them take my ship and left me for dead." Ben frowned, surprised by the question. He had expected more insults or perhaps some cold remark about his failure to comprehend her technology. But this felt different. He sensed vulnerability in her voice, a softness that hadn't been there before. He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "I guess. I didn't think about it. You needed help. And I don't just leave people or aliens behind when they're in trouble. I've been alone before, and it sucks. You shouldn't have to deal with that." Kara turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You're a fool, human. Helping someone like me comes with risks." Ben gave her a small, tired smile. "Maybe. But I've got nothing to lose." Kara's eyes flickered with a hint of something Ben couldn't quite place. Sympathy? Respect? She looked away, the intensity of the moment making her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to this feeling gratitude toward a human. But the truth was undeniable. Ben had saved her life, more than once now. "You said you have nothing to lose," Kara murmured after a long pause. "What happened? Why is your life so empty?" Ben exhaled, the weight of the question settling over him. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, but something about Kara's tone made him want to be honest. He hadn't talked about it in years, hadn't opened up to anyone, but somehow, this alien girl who had crashed into his life felt like the right person to tell. I had a family, he began quietly, his voice soft. A wife, a son. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. But then, there was an accident. A car crash. I lost them both. After that, everything sort of fell apart. Kara's gaze softened as she listened. She hadn't expected this a deep, personal story from the human. Zorians rarely shared their emotions, especially not with strangers. But here was Ben, bearing his soul without hesitation. I tried to get back into work, tried to build a life again, but nothing really fit. So I came back here, to this old shop, and started fixing things. I guess it's my way of coping. Fixing broken things. Even if I can't fix myself. Silence filled the air between them, thick and heavy. Kara didn't know what to say. On Zoria, such displays of emotion were considered a weakness, but something about Ben's honesty touched her. For the first time in her life, she saw humans in a different light. They weren't just crude, barbaric creatures, they were complex, capable of deep feeling and compassion. Your life. It's not empty, Kara said quietly, surprising herself with the words. You have a purpose. Even if it's just fixing broken things. Ben smiled faintly, touched by her unexpected kindness. Thanks. Kara sat up straighter, regaining some of her strength. We need to finish repairing my ship, she said, changing the subject. The scavengers will come back, and I can't fight them in this condition. We have to leave soon. Ben nodded, standing and grabbing his tools. I was thinking the same thing. We made some good progress yesterday, but there's still a lot to do. I've got a few ideas, though. They spent the next few hours working together, side by side, a strange sense of camaraderie growing between them. Kara guided Ben through the repairs, her expertise combining with his ingenuity. As they worked, Kara found herself respecting him more and more. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a problem solver, someone who could think on his feet, adapt to any situation. By midday, the ship's power core was functional again, thanks to Ben's makeshift solution using Earth materials. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold long enough for Kara to make the journey back to Zoria. Kara stood beside the now-repaired vessel, inspecting the final adjustments Ben had made. Her body still ached, but she was stronger now, the healing process accelerated by her advanced physiology. Ben wiped the sweat from his brow, stepping back to admire their work. That should do it. You're good to go. Kara nodded, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She should have been relieved her ship was ready, she could leave this primitive planet behind and never look back. But as she stared at Ben, she realized that something had changed inside her. She no longer saw him as just another human. He was Ben, the mechanic who had saved her life. Before she could stop herself, she turned to face him fully. You've done more for me than I expected, human. I owe you a debt. A Zorian never leaves a debt unpaid. Ben smiled, leaning against the side of the ship. You don't owe me anything, Kara. I'm just glad I could help. Kara shook her head. No. I do owe you. And one day, I will repay that debt. Ben opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, Kara stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was gentle, but there was a firmness in her gaze that told him she meant every word. You saved my life, Ben Holton. That is not something I take lightly. If you ever find yourself in need, call for me. I will hear you. Ben blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. Thanks, I guess. Kara smiled faintly, her expression softening. Goodbye, Ben. With that, she turned and entered her ship, the doors closing behind her. Moments later, the engines roared to life, and the sleek craft lifted off the ground, rising into the sky. Ben watched as the ship disappeared into the clouds, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He wasn't sure if he'd ever see her again, but something told him that their paths would cross once more. As the ship vanished into the atmosphere, Ben couldn't help but smile. Maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't so empty after all.